Hello, I am so glad to be back here with you today to reinforce the learning that took place last week and to extend it to include thinking about ways that you may be inadvertently undermining yourself with habitual, automatic, unhelpful thinking patterns. So, to get started, go ahead and grab your notebook or whatever system you're using to track your learning, and we'll start off by reviewing concepts from last week. Okay, so last week, I introduced the fundamental concept in the clinical world. It's a foundational principle of cognitive behavioral therapy, the cognitive triangle. Key takeaways with the cognitive triangle are that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are interconnected, and that if you change one, you're likely to change others. We also talked about the importance of pausing, reflecting, noticing and catching your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors, your internal experiences as well as your external environment, noticing, reflecting on those, and then intending and purposely moving forward, which we don't always do because a lot of times we're on autopilot. And so we're going to be focusing on thinking today. And so, we have this natural tendency to fall into habitual patterns, some of which involve unhelpful thinking, and sometimes we don't even realize we're doing it. So part of what I want to do today is increase your awareness about unhelpful thinking patterns that are common, that a lot of people use. So you can be on the lookout for them and you can see how they might be working in your life. In the sort of clinical world, they're called cognitive distortions or thinking errors because these thoughts are often distorted or entirely untrue, yet we believe them. And because thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are related, they're often associated with really negative feelings, right? And so when we maintain these thinking patterns, we maintain a negative mood, which is not helpful. So we're going to talk about a few of them today. I'm going to introduce them. The first one I'm going to introduce is this idea of fortune telling. Fortune telling is when you predict a negative outcome and your mind interprets it as factual without realistically considering the odds of that outcome. So with COVID, an example of that might be, I'm going to be inside. I'm going to be stuck inside for months on end. May or may not be true, but that sort of fortune telling without checking the facts, not helpful, right? Another example of unhelpful thinking that might take place during COVID is catastrophic thinking, right? And so that's when your mind jumps to the worst case scenario based on one little piece of information. So an example in COVID might be you're experiencing some symptom that could potentially be COVID related. You might have a slight fever, or you might have a tightening in your chest, hard time breathing, and your mind goes to that's a symptom of COVID. I absolutely have COVID. I'm going to be in the hospital and get a ventilator, and my life is in danger. So it's like taking it to that next step and just catastrophizing what's actually going on, right, without having the data to support it. Another cognitive error that people sometimes use is this all or nothing thinking. And that's when we think in these absolute terms, like the language we use in our thinking is always, never, every. So if you catch yourself using those kinds of words, that might be a clue to kind of notice that that's maybe not what's going on. So an example of this in COVID might be after a rough week managing your job, managing your kid, doing remote learning from home, you think this is never going to end. Right? So that's a pretty all or nothing thought, right? After a conflict with a coworker or a partner, you might think we always end up fighting and this never ends well. Really extreme thinking, all or nothing thinking, not helpful, right? Another example is a mental filter, and that is when someone has a tendency to pick out one negative detail of their life or their situation and focus on that. If there's a focus on that, sort of to the exclusion of positive things that are going on. So that mental filter actually filters out positive things that have also occurred. So you can see in a situation like COVID, where there's COVID and its impacts, where there's a lot of things that are kind of negative associated with that, that hyper focus may filter out some of the positive things that might be going on in your life, which might make it hard to, appreciate. You might have a better work-life balance, or you may actually have opportunity to spend quality time with your family that you never had. Those silver linings might get filtered out. But again, not just necessarily helpful. So these are some examples. There are many of these kinds of thinking errors. I wanted to introduce a few. And so now that I've introduced them, I want to encourage you to catch yourself um, engaging in this kind of thinking. And, the next step is checking it, right? Gathering evidence to really consider, is this a true thought? Gather evidence for it, gather evidence against it, determine whether or not this is true, and determine whether or not it's helpful, right? This is sort of reiterating what I talked about last week, and then sort of taking it to the next step. This is the exact same slide that I shared last week, wanting to, again, reinforce and extend what we've learned, but now thinking about it in terms of cognitive errors. If it's not true and it's not helpful, can you consider what is true, what is helpful, that you can shift your thinking and replace that thought with, so that you can move forward in a more positive way, right? So this is a thought record. You can access it for free online. It's something that's often used in sort of a formal cognitive behavioral therapy process. It's also useful, not in therapy. So you can find it in self-help books. I like it because it provides you with a concrete way to evaluate your process and to walk through the steps that I just talked about. So it's got an opportunity to name the situation, how you're feeling about it, the thoughts that go along with it, evidence for and against those thoughts, a place to put that alternative thought, and then an opportunity to reflect on how you're feeling when you replace that thought can be really helpful. And so we also know that writing things down, can help facilitate learning and also behavior change. So given that, this week, I want to encourage you to increase your awareness, pause and reflect, right? And pay attention to the things you're saying to yourself in your head. Again, you are the person you hear from most, and so we want to really encourage identifying when we're engaging in unhelpful thought patterns and being able to replace them with positive things that are more helpful to say. We want to limit that unhelpful thinking, maximize more helpful, positive thinking. So this week, what might you consider? Were any of these thinking patterns ones that you might be using? Are there certain circumstances under which you're triggered to engage in these unhelpful thinking patterns? And then in terms of intending and moving forward purposefully, can you catch potentially unhelpful thoughts? Can you check them, and can you change them? And can you practice using the thought record? Can you practice doing this through use of the thought record? I hope this is helpful to you. I am speaking quickly because I'm aware, trying to keep this to 5 to 7 minutes so that it's digestible to you. Hope this is helpful. Look forward to seeing you next week. I think we're going to focus on worry and managing that kind of thinking before we shift to other ways of coping. Thanks for being here with me today. We'll see you next week.